Hello, everybody, and welcome. I hope, can you hear me okay, Micah? You there?
Yep.
Excellent. Thanks for joining the stream, everybody. Good to see everybody here. Go ahead and type in chat. Let us know where you're joining from. Go ahead and just say hi, and we'll kick things off. So this is the OAuth Happy Hour, and I'm Aaron Parecki, and we've got Micah Silverman joining as well from the other coast. And we're going to talk about all sorts of OAuth stuff today. I think we've got a fun little agenda planned. So go ahead, and if you've got questions, drop them into the chat. We will make sure we keep an eye on that and hopefully get a chance to answer all your questions. And we've got a bunch of other stuff to talk about as well. So starting with, I guess, talk about what happened this week in the OAuth world. So we've got, again, this has been an ongoing, for the last several weeks, we've had IETF meetings, which have been postponed since the original meeting that was supposed to be in Vancouver, which got sort of turned into these virtual meetings spread out over the course of about 6 weeks. So this week was, I believe, the second to last one on the agenda, and it's always a good, very packed, full hour of conversations. Micah, you didn't tune into this week's, did you?
I did not. I missed this week's.
Yeah.
I was swamped.
Yeah. There's they're only an hour long, and there's like a set agenda for all of them. I'm trying to pull up the agenda right now for this last one. We had we had two, no, that's, yes, two specs being talked about this week. One is called Depop, or Demonstration of Proof of Possession, and the other one was called Incremental Authorization. So those are two new documents that are working their way through the process. And the Depop, the idea is that it's a form of proof of possession, which is the idea that just because you have an access token isn't shouldn't actually be enough to be able to go and use it. So if this is like one of the criticisms a lot of people have with OAuth2, although apparently it's been fine for the last 10 years and hasn't been that big of a deal. But this is one of the criticisms is that it's too easy for if someone can steal an access token, then it's just too easy to use it. Whereas in OAuth1 or a lot of the other ways that are where you have to sign requests, that means that it's a lot harder to actually extract tokens out of applications. So there's a handful of different approaches to this. None of them are very widely adopted. One of them that is an RFC is called mutual TLS. And the idea there is that it's a, just like you would validate the server certificate, it would also validate your certificate. And then that happens at the TLS layer rather than in the data you're sending. So it happens before the connection is made. And once that's established, then the OAuth server knows which client's making the request. And then it can do things like attach access tokens to that certificate, and then nobody can use the access token if it's stolen. The problem is that doesn't really work in browsers. So Depop is a way to do that concept of proof of possession, but have it work in browsers. And the way that it works is by doing it in the application layer. So it's actually adding parameters into your HTTP request, whereas with mutual TLS, you don't need to do that.
Now, I was poking around the specs this week, and am I misremembering it, or it seems like there's more than one Depop spec floating around out there. Is that not the case?
I think there's only one thing called Depop. There's several different things that solve this same problem.
Okay. All right, I might have just found different ways to get to the same place, maybe.
That's very likely. Yeah, the IETF website is a little bit confusing if you're not used to it in terms of how to navigate and how to find the documents there. And then the other spec that was talked about, incremental authorization, the idea there is that this is really based around, I guess, like best practices that have been really, like, I would say probably pioneered by Google, and now enforced actually by Google, where just because your application might do something like send email through someone's account, access their contacts, also read their YouTube videos or whatever, you shouldn't ask for all those permissions up front. So if you click on log into this app with Google, and then you see this whole host of things it's asking for permissions, that's not very friendly, and you're very likely to just click away and leave it, or agree to it because you don't have any other choice, and then it's got a lot of permissions that it doesn't need. So the idea with incremental authorization is that apps should only be requesting permissions as they need them, and only once it actually needs additional permissions should it go and then do another OAuth round trip to get new access tokens. So this talks about that concept, but also then ways to actually like negotiate that kind of request and communicate that information between the client and the server.
Can you summarize what that looks like in practice? So, I go to the front door, I accept a very limited level of scope, and now it wants to increment that access. What would that interaction look like?
Sure. So it would basically be like, you kind of see this already with checkout flows, where you're logged into Amazon and then you're browsing around, adding stuff to your cart, and then when you actually go to pay, you'll sometimes get re-prompted for your password.
Right.
Right. And it's that same idea where, you've logged into, actually, StreamYard, the platform we're using right now, is a good example where like this is a web application that is pushing to YouTube, which means it could use Google to log in, right? The first time you come to the website, it's just trying to get you to log in. It's just trying to figure out who you are. So all it's doing is requesting your basic profile info. Later, it needs to be able to upload to YouTube, but it doesn't need that permission when you start. So the idea is you would click login, it would do the round trip OAuth, figure out who you are, you're logged in. And then as soon as like you can, stage things and try things out, and then when you're ready to go live, it'd be like, oh, well, we don't have an access token to use with the YouTube API. So please, go click here and we're going to go do that OAuth round trip again, get a better access token, and come back. So
And would
you would
you see
basically see
like
an
a
OAuth
brand
prompt again.
new consent screen?
Yeah, you would see the consent screen again, except it would show you, I believe the idea is that it shows you only the new scopes that are being requested. So that
Neat.
you would just see, oh, this application that you've already logged into is now asking for permission to upload to your YouTube account.
And now, is this in the context of, kind of future OAuth, or is it part of OAuth 2.1? Because I didn't think OAuth 2.1 was adding any new stuff.
Yeah, this is just an extension to OAuth 2. So this
Oh, I
is
see.
building off of the existing framework. There are no plans to bring this particular concept into OAuth 2.1 at its core, but of course this would extend OAuth 2.1 just as well, just as it does extend OAuth 2.0 right now.
Right.
Yeah.
So OAuth 2.1 is not being limited in any way in terms of being able to use other extensions. It's just kind of consolidating what extensions are already currently in use for OAuth 2 and getting rid of the stuff that really should be deprecated. Is that a good summary?
That's a good summary. Yeah. So OAuth 2.1, it's taking, I would say, like the most common or most understood, most implemented bits of OAuth 2 and repackaging it up. So taking out the stuff that we all understand is not good anymore, pulling out just the good parts of OAuth 2, and then giving that a new name so that we can then not have people have to read through 12 different specs, which build on top of each other in complicated ways to actually understand what we actually mean. But when we say OAuth right now,
Right. Makes sense.
yep.
So that
So
was those two things were the focus of this week's call.
yeah, those were the focus of this week's call. It was a very rushed call because an hour is not a lot of time to get through all this.
Right.
So some progress was made, and the authors of those specs now have things to work on and go back and update. Next week is the last one on the list, and it's going to be an interesting one because it's two kind of new concepts, but we'll save those for next week once we get the recap.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's the that was the IETF call, and then there've been some pretty lively discussions on the mailing list as well, which there was actually a question here as well from the
On
chat about
Pixie.
that. Yeah. So, yeah, I see a lot of discussions in the mailing lists about Pixie and OpenID Connect Nonce. What are your recommendations? P.S. We're using both of them. So, yeah, this has been an interesting conversation. If you've followed the discussions on the list, the thread kind of blew up as of yesterday, the day before, and there's two parts of the discussion, but the discussion was primarily focused around what gets included in OAuth 2.1. The question was posed: should OAuth 2.1 just flat out require Pixie for all authorization code flows, and or is there like a good reason where you would want to not use Pixie for some other reason? And the conversation is mostly around if we say that OAuth 2.1 requires Pixie, like if that's just part of OAuth 2.1, then there are some existing systems that technically don't need Pixie because they're already solving the things that Pixie solves some other way, and those would now either not be OAuth 2.1 compliant or would have to change to add pixie in order to be OAuth 2.1 compliant. So that's the concern. If we look at what pixie does, it's solving two different problems, and that's where this starts to get really confusing. Pixie does two things. One, we know it from the world of native apps and browser-based apps, where without it, someone could just go and steal the authorization code out of a redirect and then use that to get an access token instead of the real app getting the access token. Right. With no client secret, there's no other way to prevent that. So this was one of the reasons for making Pixie in the first place. It was used primarily just in native apps, and then expanded to now in the security best practice. It says that all apps should do it as well. However, there's something else that it does, and this is the one that's a little bit more subtle, which is that that first problem is about the OAuth server wants to make sure that when it hands the client this authorization code, someone can't come along and steal the authorization code and then go use it themselves, right? So Pixie solves that problem. There's a separate problem, which is that the client, when the client receives an authorization code, it doesn't actually yet know whether that authorization code was actually intended for it or if it was injected from something else. So the problem is that, and this applies to both confidential clients and public clients. And there's a whole section in the security best practice that talks about this attack. It's called the authorization code injection attack. The problem with this one is that it also is an attack on confidential clients. So the idea is that without Pixie, a confidential client could be tricked into using an attacker's authorization code instead of the real authorization code. And because the client secret would be the same, because it's actually like a legit, it's the attacker user's authorization code that it really did get from the OAuth server, so it's not a fake one. And if you are attacking the real app, then the client secret doesn't fix anything, because the client secret's the same for both the real auth code and the fake authorization code. So the idea is that this would be a way to get logged in as somebody else, because if you could steal theirs and drop it into the real app, you would be logged in as them, and the other way around as well, where you could get an authorization code and then give it to your victim, where then they would be logged in as you. So that's bad, and there are two ways to solve it. One is using Pixie, because if you add Pixie, that prevents the client from sort of being tricked into this, because Pixie requires that the client holds state, and that state can't be then shared across these different instances of the browser or the device or whatever. The other way to solve this is by using the OpenID Connect Nonce parameter. And the way that solves it is because, again, the Nonce parameter forces the client to keep that state. So the idea is that the client would generate the Nonce parameter, get an ID token, the Nonce gets included in the ID token, which the client can then check. And then it knows, granted, it knows after it's already done the exchange for the access token, it then could figure out that, oh, I should stop processing now because this access token is somebody else's. It's not the one from this session. Now, it wouldn't actually know that until after it got the access token, which is, maybe a concern.
Great.
But also, this attack is about the client just trying to make sure that it's behaving properly itself. It's like the client protecting itself. So if it's behaving, it's not going to use an access token that it knows wasn't intended for it. So that's why that solves that. So this is the Pixie versus Nonce thing.
Right.
The trick is that Nonce solves only that problem. Nonce does not solve the problem for public clients of authorization code extraction. So for public clients, you have to do Pixie. There's no other way to fix that. Otherwise, you'll get tricked. You could just lose your authorization code, and someone could get tricked into, or someone can steal the authorization code out of the redirect without a client secret. So for public clients, you have to do Pixie. Nonce doesn't fix that. For confidential clients, you don't need Pixie to solve authorization code extraction because the client secret solves that. Pixie does solve authorization code injection, but so does the nonce parameter. So there's about this, if you look at the grid of like client types and different
It's like a
combinations of,
magic quadrant for this.
yeah, it's like if you are a confidential client and you're getting an ID token and checking the nonce parameter, then Pixie doesn't solve anything that isn't already being solved. But if you are a confidential client and you're getting an access token, now you have to do Pixie again. Otherwise, you're vulnerable to this problem, right? Because the nonce only
Now,
comes back in the ID token.
right. Now, I know we have a lot of questions, but I have a question which may be controversial, and that is, don't we kind of have to pretend that OpenID Connect doesn't exist? And in the context of OAuth, what's best for OAuth? So why even bring up, or I haven't caught up on the email thread yet, but why even mix in this concept from OpenID Connect, especially when we have a solution that kind of covers all these bases, even if there is technically a duplication if you're using both Pixie and OpenID Connect
That's the
in
argument right
that
now.
one case.
That is a great summary of this. So there's two parts to this. One, yeah, OAuth has to exist without OpenID Connect because it is a separate thing. OpenID Connect is built on top of OAuth. So OAuth needs to be able to be secure without adding in anything from OpenID Connect so that it is secure itself. There are also plenty of use cases that don't require OpenID Connect that require OAuth, right? So we need to make sure that's secure. Separately from that, there's this other problem, which is that there are a lot of deployed systems in the world that are secure because they have OpenID Connect and aren't using Pixie, and they are confidential clients. And if the spec changes and says, well, now Pixie is part of OAuth, those existing implementations now are not following the spec, right? And they either have to just live with that they're no longer OAuth 2.1 compliant, or that they have to change. And changing code is hard, and pushing out the updates to all these libraries is hard. And there is, I guess, very little benefit that those would get from adding Pixie because they are already solving the problems that Pixie solves. But yes, absolutely, like we do need to make sure that OAuth is secure by itself, and OAuth does exist without OpenID Connect. It's just that sometimes people use them both together, and that's fine, and sometimes they don't. So, yeah, this is the argument right now. So, I know myself and others are firmly in the thought that like OAuth 2.1, while the main goal is sort of consolidating documents, one of the other goals is that it should be pushing things forward and helping make things more interoperable and more secure by default. And one of the ways to do that is to just put Pixie into it so that everybody just builds it that way from the beginning, and you don't have to then wonder, well, when I pick up this library, does it actually support Pixie or does it not? Because without that requirement, a library could be OAuth 2.1 compliant even if it didn't support Pixie. So that's kind of like the interoperability, I think, is the story there, where if you go and if you're going and looking it through a list of OAuth servers and you find one that's labeled OAuth 2.1, it would be nice to know what that means exactly. And one of the things that would mean is that it does support Pixie, so that you can use it with just OAuth by itself and it's secure. Right.
So I guess I could see the concern from the other camp being, if Pixie isn't a requirement, then we can say we're OAuth 2.1 compliant today because we're using OIDC, and we have a confidential client, and there's nothing that we have to change to be 2.1 compliant. If Pixie is a requirement, then we either have to live with 2.0 or we have to make some changes to say that we're 2.1 compliant. And those changes don't really give us a lot with our current configuration because we're already using OIDC. So I can
Yep.
kind of see that argument, but I'm still on the, like, OAuth. Like, part of the motivation for 2.1 is to kind of wrangle in all these disparate extensions and to say, like, we're not adding anything new, but this is like OAuth, the good parts, and Pixie is like one of the good parts.
Yep. Exactly. So this is an ongoing discussion right now. I actually owe the list another email, which I'm going to do right after this, with some of these additional points. So it'll be interesting. Yeah, it's always a challenge, doing these things on the list and talking with people that way. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
So
Well,
speaking of,
cool.
you've had some experience on the list now, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm trying to come to be able to speak to complete noobs that are interested in getting involved, and I fall into that category. I'm maybe a millimeter past complete noob, but I definitely encountered some challenges that are some intersection of the way I learn and the way things are with the whole IETF process. So as an example, I joined the mailing list. Woohoo! I'm getting the digest. I can read them. I can catch up. That's cool. But I sent an email to the list, or so I thought. And as far as I can tell, it got lost. Like, it never made it to the list. I can't see it in the archive. I don't know if anybody ever received it.
Oh
Um,
no.
so, and I have to assume it's something that I did, but I don't know. I thought I was sending it the right way. So I just sent an email to, actually, I forget exactly what it was. I think it was OAuth at IETF.org. And
Oh, I
uh,
got that email.
okay, so then my question is, why can I not find it on the mail archive list? I searched for my
That
name,
is
I searched
a
for the subject.
that is an interesting question. Probably the answer is that search is hard and Google's the only one that does it well.
Okay.
Uh, but the the let's see. If we go to the mail archive, let
Like,
me.
when I look at the digest, I see the emails and responses and everything. Like this Pixie thread is a good example. And I was just trying to find the thread, if any, for this email that I sent. Now,
Yeah.
even if
Well,
nobody ever responded to it, shouldn't I be able to see it somewhere in a digest or something else?
yeah, you definitely should. Why don't we do this as an exercise? Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Um, this is yeah okay. This is the email list archive. So we've got
Right.
this is the latest messages just came in just now. You can see the 2.1 discussion, and the search is right up here, but I would say it's not great. The other way to
Yeah.
browse this is by thread, and this then shows you the nesting of them. But if we go back and try to find your thread, do you remember what date that was?
Yeah, it was April 27th.
We should be able to see it here. Yeah, there it is.
All right, so just scrolling around. Okay,
Um, yeah, I don't know why search didn't turn it up, but
interesting. Okay, so that's the one thing I basically didn't try, was just scrolling around. I tried various searches, advanced searches, and I just couldn't quite get there.
yep,
But at least I see that it is actually there, so that's good.
yep.
So,
So
success. I sent an email to the list.
great. Um, okay, so let's talk about this question really quick,
Yeah.
from Andreas. what's the reason why the specs allow for unsafe configs like none for pixie or the challenge method or for the none algorithm in JSON Web Token? It'd be better if the specs follow a secure by default approach instead. So yeah, this is these are two separate uses for the word none, which is interesting. But so for JSON Web Token, let's talk about these separately. So for JSON Web Token, it's possible that you can have a JSON Web Token that is signed with the signature algorithm called none, which means it has no signature, which is not really a great way to do that for an access token, for example, because then anybody can just make one up. You want a signature in the JSON Web Token so that you can know where it was signed from. The reason that it has the none option is because there are many uses of JSON Web Tokens, and some of them do not need a signature. It's just sort of a packaging up of data. So for example, if you had a way to authenticate the request from a mechanism other than the JSON Web Token signature, you don't really need to sign the token. So mutual TLS would be an example of that, where if you have a client sending a token over mutual TLS, that TLS connection is already authenticated, so there's no need for an additional authentication layer, which would be the signature. So that's the theory, anyway. Now, I agree that in practice, that is not very helpful because most of the time people are using this for things where that is the only authentication mechanism. And it would be nice if the default was just that this wasn't allowed. But that's why the none option is there. For Pixie, the none option is there. So with Pixie, the way Pixie works is when you have a hash method, the client makes up a random value, hashes it, and sends the hash in the URL. When it does it that way, it's really nice because the actual secret that's used that the client makes up never actually leaves the device until it's ready to go get the access token. So that's the most secure way to do it. And that prevents authorization codes from being useful if they're stolen, and it prevents that authorization code injection attack. Now, or it's not called none in Pixie, it's called plain. So if the challenge method is plain, it basically means that you generate a secret and then you include that secret in the request. So that has the problem of if an attacker can watch your address bar, like if you're a browser extension, for example, the attacker could get that Pixie value and use it in the request with the authorization code. So Pixie with the none method doesn't solve the problem of stolen authorization codes. However, I believe it does still solve authorization code injection because you can't trick a client into replacing its Pixie value that it made up. So again, it's only solving half the problem. The reason it was in there in the first place was because it is still valuable. Because it is still solving something. It's still valuable, even if it isn't solving everything. And there are some clients that aren't able to calculate hashes. If you think about constrained devices or even old browsers that don't have crypto libraries in them, it can be too much of a challenge to actually calculate the SHA-256 hash. So that sort of out was given so that they could still get some of the benefits of Pixie, even if it wasn't all the benefits.
One other thing I want to add about the JWT business is there have been a couple of challenges or a couple of breaches or problems with the alg none along the way for JWT, but most of them have turned out to be a problem with the service or the parser. So the fact that it exists is problematic, but then also if you have a JWT that has alg none, but also still has a signature, that's a bad JWT. Also, if your service doesn't allow alg none, that should be case insensitive. So, there was a recent issue where somebody was able to get past that because they messed around with the word none and changed up the case, and it was able to get past that. So it's definitely an argument to be made for like alg none being problematic empirically, but most of the actual problems that have occurred because of that have been related to, problems with libraries or problems with services not handling that properly. So, with Okta or other services, if Okta encounters a token that has alg none, it just rejects it. That we don't allow that in our use of access tokens, JWTs as access tokens. So yeah, definitely empirically problematic, but also implementation problems along the way also. And I think it's one of the reasons that, Paceto just gets rid of those problematic configurations. There is no alg none for something like Paceto.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that people often forget about JSON Web Tokens is that header information, it is the same as like unsanitized form data in a web page. Like you don't go around writing web apps that just believe whatever user types into the form. You validate that on the server, right? And you're not going to let the user just choose their role from a drop-down list and then process the request as if they were that role. You're going to enforce that on the server side. And it's the same thing with the JSON Web Token header. It's because the header determines how you validate the token. The header is untrusted data until you've validated it, right? So you can't just accept anything in the header. You have to have a very small list of validation methods that you do want to support, and then and in those cases, like when you're using them as access tokens, you would never have a case for the none algorithm. So don't ever let your code get in a situation of being able to accept the none algorithm or any other algorithm that isn't the one that you're using, right? So it's the same with the other problem there, which was switching to a symmetric signing algorithm. So normally access tokens are signed using asymmetric keys because the server that's going to validate the tokens is going to go use the public key of the OAuth server to validate it. But if you switch the header to say it's a symmetric signing algorithm, then you can trick the server into going and fetching the public key and then using it as a shared secret and then bypassing validation again, right? So it's just because that header is untrusted, unsanitized input, you can't believe anything it says. So I think this was kind of one of the design flaws with JSON Web Tokens, which a lot of these other versions of them, other libraries, are trying to solve, which is that you probably shouldn't have had that in the header to begin with, so people couldn't even get into the situation in the first place, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a red flag when, the quality of your library feeds into whether or not, you're going to be safe in using a particular standard. So I know with the JWT library, the Java JWT library, it doesn't allow you access to the claims until you verified the signature. And the only valid use of the header until it's verified is to understand the algorithm that was used. Now, at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of base64 encoded segments, and so you could go and manually work around the library and just go and decode that body section. But the library enforces the proper order of operation, so you can't even look at the claims if you're using the library properly until you validated the signature. But it requires you to use the library properly. So that's kind of like a code smell is what we would call that as developers. But in this case, it's like a specification smell that that's the hoop you have to go through in order to get the good stuff out of the specification. Is you have to rely on a proper library implementation. It kind of should be the other way around. The specification should guard against doing weird things with it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the other things that OAuth 2.1 is trying to do, which is removing the parts of OAuth 2 that let you do things badly, right? which is actually, so here's another question related to this. Isn't the pixie nonce discussion the same as the implicit flow? If the implicit flow is not part of OAuth 2.1, then all clients using it wouldn't be compliant. So the implicit flow is not in OAuth 2.1 because it is also being taken out of OAuth 2 by the security best current practice. So security best current practice says that the implicit flow is not allowed. Now, it doesn't actually say that literally because the implicit flow isn't actually like a thing. It's actually the response type token, which is the implicit flow. And it says that the response type token is not allowed, or rather that tokens can't be issued from the authorization endpoint. And the result of that is then, you can't do the implicit flow. And it's a little bit different because if a client or server is doing the implicit flow right now, then that's not really OAuth 2.1, but OAuth 2.1 is still a framework and like a place to build off of. So you can still add things in and have them be, have them be part of OAuth 2.1 if you're building on top of it the way that we build all these other extensions on top of OAuth 2.0. So you can't really do the implicit flow and be that, but you can still extend it in other ways. I think the main difference between the implicit flow and the pixie versus nonce discussion is that nobody wants the implicit flow to exist. So everybody's on the same page. Everyone's happy to just have it be gone, right? Whereas there is this one use case and one, very strong voice about, well, we need to make sure that the nonce is an acceptable way to still be considered part of OAuth 2.1 for all the reasons we mentioned before.
Now, this is a good tie-in, Aaron, to a more general process question with standards in the IETF, and that is when there's something like a BCP or there's a RATA to a spec, does that mean that is now kind of, for lack of a better word, the law of the land with that spec? So with the presence of the BCP as it relates to the implicit flow, does it now mean that you are not in compliance with the OAuth 2 spec if you're still using the implicit flow, or is it not quite that strong?
I don't think it's quite that strong because you can still follow. So OAuth 2 is also isn't really a thing. It's RFC 6749 is the OAuth 2 framework. RFC 6750 is bearer tokens. Then there's a handful of other RFCs and drafts that are under the same working group, under the same umbrella of OAuth 2.0. When someone says OAuth 2.0, it turns out that it might mean any combination of those documents. So there isn't really OAuth 2 compliance. There's compliance with specific RFCs. And none of them are required, right? If you want to take OAuth 2 as the foundation and then ignore some extensions, you can. That's perfectly fine. And you may not have any use for those extensions, right? Some of those, you don't need JSON Web Token access tokens if you're just building a single server, authorization server, and resource server, an API. You don't need JSON Web Token access tokens, so you can completely ignore that whole extension, and you're still OAuth 2, right? With the BCPs, if you want to just ignore it, you can. It just means that you're not compliant with that BCP. You're still RFC 6749 compliant, right? It's just that you're not following all of the different. You haven't picked all of the building blocks off of that stack. So this is actually another one of the reasons that I want to do OAuth 2.1, which is that it actually is a name that now means more than OAuth 2.0. Because OAuth 2.0 is such a big collection of so many different things. And for the most part, we all agree on what those things are, with these little exceptions we're working out right now. So I want to consolidate that and give it a name so that when someone says OAuth 2.1, we know what that means. And then we keep building off of it from there. We're still going to have extensions, and that's good. It has to work that way.
Right.
But there's at least this sort of 10 years of legacy stuff that everyone pretty much agrees what are the good and bad parts of those. So just trying to smash that together.
Right. So if somebody says, I'm using OAuth 2, I'm using the implicit flow that's part of OAuth 2. The best I could respond to that is, well, you're not observing the best current practices with OAuth 2.
Yep.
Whereas if OAuth 2.1 follows through the whole process and becomes its own RFC, then I could say, then if somebody said, well, I'm OAuth 2.1 and I'm using the implicit flow, I could say, well, that's not part of OAuth 2.1, so you can't say that you're OAuth 2.1.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. So that makes sense. There's a question. So is there a new OAuth 2 version out right now? This is, so we're talking about OAuth 2.1. I should mention that it is right now, it's not done. It's not really a thing. It's not even officially adopted by the working group yet. It's just an individual draft that myself and a few others have written. And we're talking about it in the group because we are interested in bringing it into the group, but it is not yet even adopted by the group. So it's not an official document yet.
And this is a good tie-in also, another good tie-in for the process. Like what stages does it go through, and at what point would it so right now it's a draft. That's a step in a process. At what point would it become adopted by the working group? At one point, is it its own RFC? Is ratified the right word, like OAuth 2.1 has been ratified, or is there some other word that's used internally to say, like, this is an official spec now?
I don't actually remember what the right word is, but the the process is, someone has an idea, they create a draft that looks like using the IETF tools, so using that format that you see all the time with the fixed width font. It's an individual draft at that point, which means it has no standing at all. So you see a lot of these documents thrown around as like, oh, it's a standard. Well, no, it's not. It's just on IETF.org, but it's an individual draft. It doesn't actually mean anything yet. Anybody can write those. I think someone wrote one as a joke for April Fools once to make a point of like, this doesn't actually mean anything yet. So the idea is that somebody does that, usually with a group of people, and then they work on that back and forth for a while. Oftentimes they'll publish several revisions of that draft as an individual draft, and then they introduce it to the group, and that's done usually during these meetings. Also, it can just happen on the list or during virtual meetings, and then you see, like, does the rest of the group have interest in this document? So and then if enough people do, there's a call for adoption, and it's a couple weeks long where there's a thread on the mailing list, and basically it's just to gather idea of how much support a document has. So during those calls for adoption, it's very important for a lot of people to say, yes, I want this to be adopted. Once it's adopted, it then gets renamed. So instead of like right now, if you look at it, it's like draft-Parecki OAuth 2.1 or whatever. It'll get renamed to draft-IETF OAuth 2.1 because then it is an actual official document. That's when it's brought into the group, and then it becomes a working group document. So at that point, the versioning starts over again, like the revision numbers start over, and you start doing more iterations. And that's the point where now, like, you have to make sure you're taking in all the feedback from the group, and it's sort of assumed that the whole group has agreed on whatever's in that document at that point. Up until that point, you can just do whatever you want because it's just your own draft.
So at this point, it's really just who's ever interested in contributing to this draft. But if it advances, then it would really be the responsibility of the working group to take an interest and to kind of move it along.
Yeah. And then eventually, after that's gone through several iterations and discussions, and it's sort of everyone's on the same page and agrees with everything in there, there'll be a last call, and that's to actually finalize it. So then that gets bumped up through the IETF. This is all done within a working group. After the last call, then it gets like submitted into the processes of the IETF itself, where it gets looked at by people outside of the working group. And I haven't had one of mine go through that process yet, so I'm not super familiar with the details of that. But that's when you get people from other groups or other positions in the IETF looking at it and making sure that it's, you know, not conflicting with the names of other things, or it's formatted correctly and all that stuff. And then finally, it'll get its RFC number after that.
Cool. For anybody that may be interested, one of the things that I found handy in trying to wrap my brain around this is datatracker.ietf.org. You can actually look at all the different phases that OAuth 2 went through in this process, from the drafts to, excuse me, getting adopted by the working group, and you can kind of see the historical flow and the historical record of the path that it took, you know, to become its own RFC. I found that to be helpful, just to see that historical record through the data tracker.
Yeah, let me share this real quick so we can see that. So this is the page for the OAuth 2 RFC 6749. So you can see here how many, like when it started, right, which was April 2010, and it's gone through a whole bunch of revisions. What I thought was really interesting was, notice here how there was about a 6-month period of no changes during draft 10. This was around the time that I actually started getting involved. But because it was such a long time of no changes, a lot of the early APIs that were adopting OAuth 2, that's what they were reading. Because it was clear that OAuth 2 was like, okay, this is how we're going to do things in the future. And that was the latest version of the document in 2010. So a lot of the APIs implemented that and then never changed anything past then. So there's still a lot of services out there that are draft 10 compliant and never renamed or updated past then, because at that point they were already deployed. And
right. And then there were another 20 revisions past that, or 21 revisions past that.
Yeah. And some of the revisions are just typo fixes, you know, minor stuff, but sometimes it is actually like renaming a parameter, for example. Yeah, so cool. Then RFC 6749, that's the last date of that one, October 2012. And yeah, so you can see here the reviews that have been done. So the last call reviews are done by these different groups outside of the OAuth working group. If you go to the OAuth working group's homepage here, this is actually where you see all of the drafts that are currently in the works. So we've got, there's the active, means it's an adopted item, and it is in progress in some stage of the progress. Some of these, this is in the last call, for example. This is just in the works. This one is past last call, and it's about to get its RFC number. And then if we go down, there's the actual RFCs that are done with all their RFC numbers. Sometimes they're best current practices, sometimes they're proposed standards. And then down here are related drafts. These are the ones that are individual drafts. So these are not yet adopted. So you can see here's OAuth 2.1, which is still just an individual draft, and a couple others as well. And then I actually just realized that one of my other ones expired, and I need to go publish a new update before Monday, because that's when we're talking about on Monday. It would show up in there too, but it has expired, so it is dropped from that list.
So in this view, this is actually one of the questions I have. When it's active, it means that it's been adopted, and related just means it's not yet. It's working its way through the process.
Yeah, well, related means it's an individual draft, but it was tagged with this group, so it shows up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. And while we're on the topic, when you look at, if you go back to the previous screen you were on, it's got the obsoletes tag. So that's very clear to me, like what, you know, RFC 6749 obsoletes 5849, which is OAuth 1. That makes sense. But then it says updated by, And then there's this later RFC from 2017 that speaks to OAuth2 for native apps. What does that mean exactly that it's updated by? Does that mean that RFC 8252 is like the source of truth for OAuth2 or something
It's,
else?
I think because this is a BCP, not its own actual spec. I think the idea is that this replaces like anything that this talks about the core. This is now considered more accurate. If that makes sense. So it's not a complete replacement because it's not its own RFC. It's a best current practice. But anything in here does update whatever the corresponding part of the 6749 would be. That makes sense?
So for the BCP that you co-authored for browsers, is it possible that it could get to a point where that was also a listed as an updated by or something?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe that. Let me go back to the list of the working group list. So the browser-based app one should be in here somewhere. Here it is. I believe this will then replace OAuth 2 core the same way the native apps one did. So we should then see on the OAuth on the 6749 page updated by this document as well.
Right. I mean,
And
that's
then
good to
OAuth
know
2.1.
because I think most people refer to, that start to get involved with this, refer to 6749 as like, that's OAuth 2. But it turns out that it's been updated by some other things that
Yep.
are more modern, more relevant.
And that's the problem which OAuth 2.1 is trying to solve.
Right.
So the problem is that if you start here, 6749, that's great, but don't forget to read 6750. Also, don't forget to read the rest of these and make sure that
Right.
you're doing them if you care about them. Some of them don't matter for you necessarily.
You get into the weeds of RFCs pretty quick.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to make sure that someone coming at this for the first time does not have to follow that path because it's a deep, deep rabbit hole.
Yeah. We have a couple minutes left, and there was a question that I wanted to address. It's near and dear to my heart. We have a lot of questions, and I really appreciate it. But migrating from Implicit to Pixie, important to do now, especially that it's a best current practice, and it's now a lot easier. And the short and unsatisfying answer is that it's going to depend on what service and what libraries you're using for how you go about doing that. The good news is that tactically it's not that bad. It's the authorization code flow without a fixed client secret. And so you have to put together some additional query string parameters. But if you're using a good library, it'll do a lot of that heavy lifting for you. So I'm biased. I work for Okta, but Okta has this Auth.js library that you literally just have to change the response type from token to code. And then internally, it does all the heavy lifting for you. It generates the code verifier and the code challenge. When it gets back the code, it automatically does that additional call that it needs to do to exchange the code for the token. And you don't have to change another line of your code. So hopefully you're using a library that's similar in that way. If you're not using the Okta library, hopefully you're using one that's similar where it's done a lot of the work for you and you just have to change some configuration. And now you've kind of magically switched from implicit to Pixie in your SPA app. But if you're rolling your own or you're not using a library like that, tactically what you have to do is switch the response type to code, make sure you include the code verifier and code challenge. And then when you get the code back, instead of getting the tokens, now you're getting the code back, you have to now exchange that code for tokens, and then you can continue on as you were with your SPA app because now you have tokens. Anything you want to add to that, Aaron?
No, that's exactly it. Yeah, the first thing I would do is figure out what library you're using and check that library to see if it supports Pixie already. because there's a good chance that it does. And if it does, the change that you have to make is really probably just going to be some config to tell it to do pixie. If you're either not using a library because you wrote it from scratch, then you will have to go and add the pixie bits in there. I have a blog post that talks about the actual like raw JavaScript that you need in order to do pixie. Let me drop a link to that in the chat. But if you, but yeah, it's not that much code. So hopefully it's not too much work. Of course, the first thing I would do actually before either of those is make sure that the server you're using supports pixie as well, because most of them do, but double check, because if you do the pixie on your side but the server doesn't support it, you're not going to see anything wrong. You're not going to like get any errors. It just won't actually be giving you any benefit. So you want to make sure that you're doing it the right way. And I think I found the link to the blog post. Yeah, this post is I'll screen share it really quick too. This is where are we? Back here. Oops, wrong tab. The blog post goes through. First, it has a fun video that myself and another coworker filmed talking about the implicit flow and why it's not a good idea. But then it also goes into down below, walks through actually building it out from scratch, and it's doing it all with plain JavaScript, not with any libraries. So this is where we get into the code of like doing the base64 encoding, doing the hashing and things like that. So it's not too bad. It's a good read.
Cool.
Yeah, and then once you've done the implicit or done the pixie flow instead of implicit, you're going to end up with the access token the same way you would, like the result is the same, right? You've got the access token now from the server. So however you were storing the access token before with the implicit flow, you don't need to change anything to store the access token that you got via pixie. It's just the actual exchange and the redirects that are a little bit different. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for it. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but thank you so much for joining. Let's go ahead and wrap this thing up and call it a day. But thanks so much, everybody, for joining. And we'll be doing this again next week. So good luck. Happy coding. And have a great rest
See you
of the
next
day.
week.